Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have on the show returning Roger, who I just recorded an episode with a few weeks ago, the author of Mao Hold Bitcoin, and also a contributor to Forbes and others writing about Bitcoin and Nostr. And we also have Will, the founder of Damus, creator of Zaps, and so many other things across the Nostr landscape to talk about Nostr, to talk about freedom tech, to talk about freedom of speech, censorship, why Nostr is better and different than centralized companies, and why protocol is better than companies. We get into all of this in this episode. There's so much going on in the world with censorship, with freedom of speech, with Telegram, with elections coming up, with Bitcoin, and with trying to grow Nostr, and why we all really feel that it is the lifeboat. It is the important and best way to return to how the internet originally was, which is decentralized. So talking about decentralized solutions, all in this episode. I know you all are going to love it, including some of you Bitcoiners. I know some Bitcoiners out there fudding Nostr a little bit. We get into that and to why Nostr is really important and why you should give it another chance and support the devs in Nostr. So seriously, if there's, if you want to check in the show notes, I'm going to put ways you can support Nostr development. Roger is also going to be at PubKey this Thursday talking in an HRF event. That event registration will be in the show notes as well. So check out all of that. Subscribe to Damus Purple. We mentioned that as well as a way to support Will and support Damus and a host of other clients that you can get into for Nostr. So definitely enjoy this episode. Also give a shout out to Fountain, which I've been trying to plug more recently. It is my favorite podcasting app to use. They also are Nostr enabled at this point, so you can actually log in with your Nostr credentials into Fountain, which is really cool. You can support the show there. You can send us zaps and boost shows and podcast episodes you really like, as well as receive Bitcoin just for listening to shows. So I encourage you to check out Fountain, support us there. We'd really appreciate it as we try to do podcasting in a value for value way and create content. It's really interesting, really different for people to learn from. So anyway, I'll let you get into the episode now. Be sure to check out our sponsor and partner links in the show notes as well to get discounts on awesome Bitcoin products. And if you want to hit me up, you can hit me up on Nostr. You can hit me up in our Telegram group, which is in the show notes, or at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com. All right, enjoy the episode, and we'll see you again next week. Roger, Will, welcome to the show. How are you both doing?
Doing well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, definitely. This is, and for folks that have listened, you'll know that me and Roger had a conversation a few weeks ago about his book, Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? And we talked about China and Bitcoin. And we got into some freedom tech, freedom of speech, but we didn't get to really touch on the Nostr component. So this episode is going to be really devoted to that and continuing that conversation. So if folks didn't listen, you don't necessarily have to listen to that episode first, but that was a great episode. If you haven't listened, you can listen to it after. But Roger, I wanted to kick things off. And, why don't, before we get in, Roger, give a little intro to yourself again for people that didn't listen, and then we'll have you give a little intro to yourself as well.
Yeah, sure. Briefly, I've been writing about Bitcoin since 2014. Most recently, mostly with Forbes. I published a book with Bitcoin magazine called Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? And it's about the intersect between Bitcoin and China. And throughout it, talked a lot about Nostr, because obviously these topics we're talking about, freedom of money, freedom of speech, super connected and super essential.
Awesome. Will, over to you.
Cool. Yeah. I am, I guess, an old time Bitcoiner. Got in at 2010-ish. Bitcoin core developer. I just submitted probably 10 or 12 patches, nothing crazy. Worked on core Lightning network stuff, and now I'm working on Nostr.
Sweet. All right, let's jump in. So I think there's a lot to talk about. There's every day there's new news, new negative news about bans, about attacks on freedom of speech, censorship, freedom movements around the world. And I think that is where I want to hone in with this conversation on the why of Nostr, the why. Will, you're building things that you are. Roger, you're focusing on the journalism that you are. And so maybe, Roger, we can pick up where we left off in terms of the conversation with China and Nostr. And if you can touch on a little bit in your book, and then we can pivot over to Will to talk about Damus and your lovely interactions with China. Maybe not directly, but Damus's interactions with China. So, Roger, can we talk a little bit about what Nostr and dev work and communities like that have looked like from China interacting with Nostr, and the why in terms of something like Nostr being so important here?
Yeah, there's an outlet that I've been kind of working with. I haven't had a published article with them, but I always recommend it. It's called Rest of World, and it really covers human interest stories about the Chinese internet, China's technology, and the communities. And I find it really interesting because I think people have a very static view of the Chinese internet. Like, I think there's this like kind of like view that, oh, it's just like a censored hellscape. And in some senses that can be true, depending on which parts of the Chinese internet you're touching, especially like on WeChat and different groups. But there's also like a huge amount of people who are just like out there and doing different things and communicating different groups. And it's been really interesting to see where they ended up. Some of them have ended up on Reddit. Some of them have ended up in Discord groups. Some of them have ended up like here and there. But I've been focusing a lot on Nostr. And I think one of the things I've seen is like, you get like all kinds of groups. Like I was actually just looking through because I had done a scrape of like all Mandarin posts I could get from like different relays. And you really do have like such a wide variety. In some ways, it's actually like probably more diversified than even the Western version of Nostra, I guess you could say. There's like pop stars on it. There's people sharing there's people sharing porn. I think that might just be like Nostra in general. But I do want to highlight that a little bit because like these can be somewhat subversive actions. Like in China, for example, people forget, but it's a very socially conservative country. So, for example, women, they can't get their eggs frozen without the approval of a male guardian and things like that. Like LGBTQ, you can't like have same-sex marriages from mainland China, etc. And so, even having the like a forum and ability to express yourself fully, like Nostr is that for some people. But then I also think like, there's people. I wrote an article about it for my domain, ChinaBitcoinBook.com. I just kind of like summarize some of the excerpts. And one of the things that was most exciting for me is people were just talking about their day-to-day lives. And that doesn't really happen. So I used to be part of Clubhouse, like the huge wave there. And we had the largest English language room on China. So we hosted all kinds of different subject matter experts, mostly Americans or journalists who had done reporting in China. But when Chinese people ended up going on Clubhouse en masse, one of the really interesting things was like the genuine conversations that were had. Like people were really talking about their day to days, and that is happening on Nostr. Like there's enough volume. Like if you look at the Chinese accounts, they kind of follow each other, and yeah, they follow like the main accounts as well. Like they'll, I guess, renote or boost, like Lin Alden stuff, and there's like Bitcoin stuff that kind of interplays. So there's definitely that element, but they also follow each other and they just talk about life. Like they talk about like, oh, I found this car, or I found something else, or housing prices are going down. It's like terrible. So there is a lot of different conversations, and that's why I think Nostr is really interesting. So in response to the article I posted, like a bunch of people from mainland China and some of them in the diaspora kind of replied to that, and they were like, some people were like, oh yeah, like the political censorship of other platforms means that Nostr is more appealing. But also other people were just like, we like to have fun on this network. And because it doesn't have like, you don't need like a phone identifier. You don't need like, there's relays that can be run without VPN access. Like if you were to redesign a resilient social network, that would be Nostr. Because like it doesn't use any of these identifiers. And in the context of China, that's like so important because people are so used to their phones like not being able to receive confirmation texts or not being able to download certain things from the App Store. I mean, I think Will might talk a little bit about that. But with Nostr, you finally have the ability to like, it doesn't matter. You can have a desktop client and it just looks like regular web traffic, right? You just find the right relay and then you're able to have access to all this content and you can post that content. So the Chinese element, definitely really fascinating. But I like to think it is like a larger conversation of like, the fact that Nostr is built the way it was, it's ideal for so many use cases. And China happens to be like one of the most hostile, but there are other countries that are fast following that model as well.
Yeah. And Will, right before jumping on, we were talking about you're thinking about the future of Nostr and the future of what these things look like. And I think, every week, a lot of people probably at this point have seen that Brazil has banned X. Folks are trying to, figure out how to access it through VPNs, and they put a huge fine on VPNs. There's all this kind of scary fear factor intimidation stuff going on around accessing social media and being able to just post your opinions or your thoughts. Or Roger, like you were saying, some people, especially on Nostr, just want to say, yeah, I had a barbecue with my family this weekend. It's not just all of these political activists, even though there's a huge use case for that. It's kind of our ability to access and utilize free speech and have like a town hall or share whatever you want. So Will, when you think about the future of Nostr, where's your head been at the past few weeks in terms of the need, the use cases? Do you feel like things have started to speed up? And I don't mean just in terms of user activity and things like this, but in terms of like, I feel like there's so much momentum and so much things happening, for better or for worse, around the world. It's like, oh my gosh, Nostr is just a natural, like Roger said, like if you were going to build this social networking app, but it's so much more than that. So where's your head at with Nostr these days?
No, I mean, it's kind of funny because it feels like tyrants are our chief marketing officer sometimes. So it's like we saw in France, like Macron, arrested the Telegram guy. And now we have Brazil, people getting, you can't use VPN and now they're blocking X. And these are just perfect examples of like why we need Nostr. And then this is why we're seeing a huge uptick right now. Is like people are, it's easy to like ignore Nostr if there's no problem. If everything's happy, use X, everything's great, until you can't use X anymore because your government's trying to, censor or stop free speech. So Nostr is like the perfect thing to go to if you're under attack from tyrants and things like that. So yeah, I guess that's what we're seeing right now is like another huge uptick, and I think we're going to continue to see more of these upticks when as the world becomes more dystopian, as the world becomes more fiat, and then the pack everyone starts eating each other. I feel like tyranny is going to increase over time, and then Nostr is our lifeboat in the same sense that Bitcoin's our lifeboat for money.
Yeah, and Roger, can you talk a little bit more about, because there's so many, like that alone is a use case for Nostr, but I've seen a lot, and I'm curious both your takes on this. I've seen a lot of people say, and again, it's true for better or for worse. And I feel like Jack was saying this a lot. Jack was talking about like, listen, people aren't going to come and use Nostr. Like some of these use cases, yes, but the majority of people, whether it's in the US or other places, are not going to come because a place is censorship resistant or, these kind of things. Like people are going to come for speed and because they want to use it and because it's fun to use and whatever. So with that in mind, where do you think we are in the life cycle of Nostr, that balance of being a place where people are coming to use it because they want to, not necessarily because they have to, and the convergence of some people coming on Nostr because it's their only way to communicate with a broader network of people?
I've always said that, most people actually don't really care about censorship resistance. Like we throw that around a lot, and actually just like 99.9% of people just don't really care. So the only way we're going to get people interested in this, freedom platform is to just make it better, make it more interesting, make the experiences more varied and more interesting. And then Nostr really enables these types of things. With Twitter, you only kind of get their experience, and it's in a silo, right? So you join, you get the microblogging experience. You might get some cool new goodies like Grok and things like that. But for the most part, it's a silo. You can't interact with other platforms. So Nostr, the way that I look at it is that what's going to draw more people in is the interoperability and the synergy it has with the other social apps. And I really like what Rabble says. It's really the social app protocol. It's a way of connecting all these different apps together. In the same way that the web, it kind of connected documents together, Nostr is connecting applications. So you can imagine this on your phone. You look at your phone, you have all these apps and they're all siloed. But imagine a future where all those apps on your phone, they all interact with each other. You can log in with the same key. You have all the same social graph. You have all your friends and they're all just, and all the apps that become are just different presentations of all the same data. And this is where Nostr is going to win and why it's going to show its true strength and its power compared to the other solutions.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. So, Roger, where is that balance for you in terms of, most people in the world aren't caring about censorship resistant unless they need to. And, like, as you had mentioned, like some of the Mandarin language users, Chinese users coming on Nostr and just posting about their daily life. And you kind of alluded to it. I wonder if you wanted to elaborate more about how how different that might be for Chinese citizens interacting with social media, microblogging, digital voice, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit more about that. I got to start this by saying that like I'm more of a user of the system. I've kind of played around with like Nostr's data and stuff like that, so that's kind of like where I'm coming from, writing about it more. But the Chinese element is like a fascinating case study, I think. The reason why is because people do use it for kind of those reasons that you mentioned. But China's just got like a very particular kind of like adversarial model where they like really don't want you to like use apps or like take down apps, which happened with Damus. And like, you know, they really don't want you communicating with the outside world. So this creates like a really weird dynamic in other social media networks, which is that, for example, on X, it's not like there isn't Chinese people on X, but all the Chinese people on X are like actually, or called Twitter or whatever, or I don't like, or like people
It's
call it
very
shit
much X now
or whatever. Yeah. I mean, yeah, if you're not going to censor me, I'm called a shitter, but like people are just literally like, you know, they're on there to make a point. They're not actually like blogging about their lives. They're because they have to like go through the great firewall. And then there's all these like, because the thing that X prioritizes is really like rage algos. So then you have like people like from, and I've interacted with a lot of them actually. And they're there to like make a point. They're like, oh, we're going to invade Taiwan or like whatever. Like you just like all this like back and forth between these like different mobs. So like imagine all the different random like fights that happen on like Bitcoin Twitter. The same thing happens in like every element of Twitter. It's just the way it's set up, right? So I think that Nostr allows two things. Like one is like the people who like use it kind of are like, I mean, this is like as a result of it being at like an earlier stage of development, but the people who are using it are people who are seeking it out. So again, it's like some people who have that interplay on the Bitcoin side. There are people, and I should be clear about this, like there are people who do post dissident stuff. I've seen posts about Tiananmen Square. I've seen posts about citizen whistleblowers, journalists who have been detained in Wuhan for doing research on COVID-19. So that definitely exists. And those are on Nostr and they will forever be on Nostr, right? And there's no way for the Chinese government to like remove that. They can like deny access to some relays that are serving it, but they can never remove it, right? That's the beauty of Nostr. But yeah, to our earlier point, like I don't know that like the vast majority of people, even Chinese people for which censorship resistance is like such a huge element, necessarily think of it that way, right? I think there's like people in the network and like when we write about it, that's like a very exciting element. But when you break it down, people just want to really communicate with one another in a genuine fashion with like, you know, the right conversations, the right dialogues. And I really like what Will said. I've been writing about that a lot more often, which is like Nostr isn't just the social media side, right? It really is kind of like the backbone for a new kind of way of using an identity in order to access all kinds of different functionalities, right? There's like Fountain, there's podcasting, there's Nostr Nests, there's like all kinds of different things there, right? And I think like that's going to be the reason why people will join more and more. Like you're going to see spikes because people are going to get censored, but a lot of them recent people are like people who are on Bitcoin Twitter and who are like, I think it's a bad idea for me to be on Bitcoin Twitter exclusively. So they're going to Nostr, right? Which is cool. Don't get me wrong, but it's kind of like people coming home to roost, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like the vast majority of people don't, and I mean, Will, I'd love to hear your take on this, but like, I don't think people really care about the back end of things. You know, like users really don't care about the back end. So they may not really even understand the back end until there's something so obvious. Like, for example, like
it just stops working or something.
Yeah, it just stops working. Like I literally can't access it, that's the censorship part, right? Like if a country takes it down, then everybody in the country is going to be like, oh, whoa. But I mean, in general, I don't think people like actually, like we're talking about all these concepts. It's like very abstract to people. But things that are tangible and solid are like, for example, you don't need to use an email or a phone. That's like really easy to communicate to people.
And there's some really interesting aspects of the protocol. I will get slightly technical because I think it's interesting in the context of China. So, you know, a big part of the App Store in China is that like the most banned app, because I was talking to these guys, I think it was applecensorship.com, and they've been tracking all the apps that have been banned in different countries. And they do this by looking at like the App Store in one country and then compare it to an App Store in another country and see if the app exists there. And the highest banned category is VPNs. So China is like very very adamant about banning VPNs and like private and tracking activity and things like that. So one advantage that Nostr has actually is that it doesn't require like, traditional things like Tor or VPN. It actually hides most of its traffic through WebSockets, which is just standard web technology that is like ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So Nostr has a really unique advantage of it just looks like normal web traffic when you're using Nostr. So that is like safer, I would argue, for like, citizens within that country, because then they could run the relays within the country and it just looks like normal web traffic. But it was really interesting when China banned Damus, because right away they just banned the app right off the App Store within like a day of me launching it, which was I found that so surprising because no one even knew really about Nostr at the time. I think what happened, my guess is that they saw it went up to 25,000 downloads in a day, and there must be some like alarm that goes off at the CCP that's like, whoa, free speech app category is getting really popular. And then I think that's why they banned it. But then a month later, they did something way more advanced, which was very impressive to me, is that they looked at all my Bootstrap relays, so all the ones that that Damus initially connects to, and they banned every single one within China. And I was like, whoa! So like they had someone on the team that was like investigating Nostr, and then a month later they got more advanced banning of it. But yeah,
and
but
Will,
then
when was this? Like what?
This was when I launched it, like 2021 in January, I think, or February.
Okay.
And then a month later they banned the Bootstrap relays, and then I had to do a patch where it's like, anytime you update your relay list, it now uses those as the Bootstrap relays. So from what I understand, some of the users were just like using internal relays, and then they could still use Nostr. And because some users still actually had a Hong Kong Apple account, so they can access Damus from mainland China. It's like a weird workaround, but so it's interesting. There's a little bit of back and forth between China and Damus. But like in reality, they can't stop it though, because you can just run a desktop client. You can write your own client and just connect to a server that effectively looks like a web server, and it's really hard to stop. So I think that has a huge advantage over other solutions.
Yeah,
I think what's tricky. Oh, go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, and I was going to say, like, to echo onto what Will said, you're going to see more countries do. So China, by far, Apple releases a report. And Apple has a lot of incentives, by the way, just giving my shot in on Apple. I did in my book as well. They have a lot of incentives to cooperate with China, or they used to.
Oh, sure.
Now there's
they're trying to diversify with India, maybe, but still they'll have the same situation in India, because India loves censoring as well. Yeah.
Yeah, the manufacturing is there. And then for a while, like a lot of Chinese consumers of Apple products, that's cooled down a little bit. The Chinese government, if I remember correctly, actually banned people from using Apple phones. So that's actually kind of slowed their roll a little bit. But the point is that like Apple has this report, and it says like, here's the number of like app takedowns that were requested by countries. And they break it down by country. And by far the largest is China. Like it's like not even close. It's like, I think China requested like, I forget the exact number, so I don't want to quote them right offhand. But if you just look up, I think it's called like the Apple Transparency Report or something on like App Store takedowns. Like there's like thousands of takedowns that they've like basically China requested it and it got took down. Right.
Yeah. And if you go to applecensorship.com, they give you a more up to date that like things that are happening right now. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I wasn't even familiar with that site, but like, I'm sure it'll also show like a kind of like similar thing. But the thing is, countries are going to do that more and more because they're going to lean on like the App Store. And one of the interesting things I see with people using Nostr is that like, this is for Chinese people, but I imagine it's going to happen for like other countries as well. They're like teaching each other like how to circumvent these things. So for example, in China, because App Store takedowns are so common, and they also have some level. They have some level. This has happened with Signal, where they like track the SMSs for like verification on phone, because they have control of like the domestic telecoms. So like you can effectively like prevent people from like downloading or using apps. And then you see people on Nostr. I've seen this like a few times where they're like, oh no, like use this APK, or use this like desktop client, right? A lot of the Chinese users use like Iris, because I think it comes from like desktop. I mean, some of them have used Damus in the past, and I think still maybe using it, just maybe using different relays. But you see this like kind of like, yeah, like this is how you can spread knowledge about this, and this is how you can use the internet in a way that you can like not evade, I guess, like not really evade, but just like to be free and to be like really uncensored in your choice of like platforms and apps. And I think the reason why it's increasingly more relevant is now people realize that's not like China is such a dystopian place and it can only happen in China. Like, no, like Brazil is basically doing that right now, right? Or like there's other countries that are probably going to follow that model as well.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about Nostr in these conversations, because there's a there's like a technical component as a builder, software developer. There's all these connections with Bitcoin, all these technical components of how the relays work and this and that. But then social media is also, in our day and age, it's such a psychological conversation, because there's a lot of people that come to Nostr and we talk quite a bit about this. There's so many reasons why I use Nostr, but one of the reasons I use Nostr and I feel better on it versus X, which I stopped using, there's so many psychological components of algorithms and being addicted to scrolling and things like that. And sure, maybe you can do that a little bit. It's just harder to be addicted in that same way to Nostr right now. Maybe at some point it will be more addictive. But there's like the psychological component. There's a free speech component. And one of the things, just being on this podcast, and I wrote an article last year really focused on like my background and group of people, which is left and progressives. And you see some of them talking a little bit more about the dangers of free speech. Maybe some will say that directly, but others will say it more like around elections or around certain topics or things like this. And then you have the false flag flying, freedom of speech folks like Elon Musk or Donald Trump's like, I'm going to create Truth Social, and it's, still kind of centralized capture there and things like that. So it's so complex to talk about Nostr because of all of these things. But going forward, I do think this could happen more and more in the United States, and will. I'm not saying this is a dystopian thing, but I do think there will be more. It's already happened quite a bit in the UK as well. There's been quite a bit of that in terms of what people post on social media, and is it legal or illegal now? Those kind of things. I think there's a bit more legal challenges in the US around that. But Will, how do you think around those things, like communicating what we're talking about here, where you can say it's just like Bitcoin? It's very similar metaphors in terms of like 99% of the transactions are just like normal people, like legal, right? And let's say legal from a Western framework, because there's some things that are illegal in other jurisdictions that we in the West would say, oh, it shouldn't be illegal, right? But just using Bitcoin, using it for your daily life, doing all of these things, not trying to use it for criminal activity. Same with Nostr, right? We could just say people are just trying to have a different experience, a better experience, or they're trying to just put out content that their political rivals wouldn't like, or these kind of things. So how do you balance that when thinking of the future, knowing that building resilient systems and moving forward, knowing that in all likelihood, more countries are going to add bands of relays or bands of X to the list here for what you do for a living and what you're building?
Yeah, any new technology, people are going to use it for good and for bad, right? The way that I look at Nostr and the way that I look at Bitcoin is that we're just leveling the playing field. Bad things can happen on it, good things can happen, but let's have a something we can build on top of that's fair from the get-go, and then we can build more advanced tooling on top of that. Like if you want to use a client that's heavily censored, you don't want to see certain things. I don't want to see Nazi stuff in my feed. I don't want to see child porn in my feed, right? So we obviously need filtering capabilities and tools for managing spam and bad content, illegal content, reporting illegal content. But if you build that into the base layer, then people can use that and then abuse that for censoring people they don't like, censoring a political opinion they don't like. So I get that people are concerned of this idea of Nostr being this like Wild West, and a lot is going to be filled with hate content. Surprisingly, that hasn't been the case. Like people, when they first join Nostr, this is the first thing they'll notice is like, why is it nicer here? This is unrestricted speech, yet people seem nicer, people seem friendlier. So I actually have two theories as to why this. I've been thinking about this a long time. So my first theory was, on traditional social media, they're really just trying to get people to stay on the platform, get clicks. So it doesn't really matter what the content is, as long as the algorithm is pushing people into certain content and keeping them engaged, then that's the only thing that matters to the algorithm. So things like fight videos, things like, people fighting and arguing. And so the best way to become an influencer on platforms that have algorithms like this is to like promote hateful content, promote like things that are going to get people angry, get people to like click it. And this is making people miserable. You see it on these traditional and legacy social medias. Like people are mad, people are getting angry, people are, and this is a direct result of these algorithms that are simply just trying to make more money. So there's that aspect, which this was my original theory, but I have a new theory, which is probably a combination of it's probably both these things. My new theory is that the minute you have a long-term key that you're associating your credibility and your reputation with, you're less likely to, and since you can't use algorithms to like become an influencer. You can't use hate and all these things. You actually have to think about the old ways of doing it, which is, posting interesting content, being polite, and also the zaps also reinforce this as well. So people are more likely to zap you if you're nicer, or putting out interesting content. So I think the combination of those two things makes Nostr a nicer place to be for most people, and why it's like anger content is like less likely to be there.
Yeah, I agree. That's super interesting. And one of the things, like I was when I was originally toying with the rebrand, which I've already said before, we're going to do towards the end of the year, but I was originally toying with the rebrand to rebooting money a few months ago. And I kind of like wanted to solidify a handle on X. So I just kind of grabbed one and it had 0 followers, 0 people following. If you go on the home feed or what the For You feed, whatever it is on X, the amount of like, oh my God, that that was on there with 0 followers, 0 like crazy, whether it was like porn or fight videos or just very politically like AI videos that would say they were AI, but just absurd. Like I hadn't clicked on anything yet. I hadn't said any of my preferences. I hadn't given it anything. And the same with TikTok. I've experienced that as well, where you go on the feed. I kid you not. I know this is super gross. It was like you open up TikTok because we have the podcast on TikTok. Well, I upload just little clips of the show like twice a week. That's it. I don't interact on it. Just kind of upload that, whatever. And there's a video of like someone like popping a zit was like the video on the phone. I'm like, what is going on? It's just like, but it's that train wreck. It's that emotion. It's that like, oh my God, we're a cog in the wheel thing that is a huge part of why Nostr exists and why we're questioning these algorithms, or at least the way they're introduced and built, in addition to all this censorship resistance. So even for like my US or Western friends that aren't worried about censorship right now in this moment, although there's many reasons to be, regardless of your whatever politics ideology, there's also these practical reasons. It's like, oh, I don't want to be a part of that. I talk to my like liberal friends all the time, right? Because Elon Musk is like the real big boogeyman for liberals, right? Or the left, or a lot of people. I'm just like, if you hate Elon so much, why do you use X? Like, why don't you try Nostr? Like, come over and use it. Like, I know it's small, but just try that out. You don't have to be a part of it. It's like daily, there's more and more reasons to use Nostr. And it's also getting better at the same time, which is really cool.
I think people are conditioned to think that any of these new platforms are just full of Trumpers and like Nazi people and things like that. I think Nostr is like a really unique beginning where it's full of, there is some like, a lot of Bitcoiners happen to be a little bit more right. But for me, like I'm kind of in the center. I'm not like super aggressive politically either way. And I find it just fine to use. I find it pretty pleasant. So if you're afraid of, just don't be afraid. Just jump in and see, it's a very diverse group of people right now. I mean, a lot of Bitcoiners still, but it's getting more diverse.
Well, and this ties into Shinobi, who's now has started using Nostr again recently. Is one of the editors at Bitcoin Magazine. Has been using Nostr more, which I was like, you got to get over here and post on Nostr more, because he was hitting me up on X all the time. I'm not going to be here. Like, thanks for the support and everything. Come over to Nostr. So anyway, he wrote an article recently that was interesting, and it was actually talking about politics in terms of like Bitcoin and politics and will Democrats pivot and this and that. And his point was like, perception is the issue here. So with like Bitcoin, like there's so many, we've seen like all these great studies that show like Troy Cross, I've talked about him a lot recently with like the Nakamoto project, did a study that showed like actually people who literally like own Bitcoin, like Bitcoin itself, not crypto, but Bitcoin, are just very politically diverse. They kind of represents the average of what the US population looks like. And I'm sure that's the case in like Canada as well. I know there's a super rich like Bitcoin scene in Vancouver, and Vancouver would be considered more of like a left city and things like that. It's a kind of absolutely ridiculous at this point, right? The people who own it, maybe they're not as involved on like Bitcoin Twitter and all of this stuff, right? But there's this perception issue. So I think a lot of it, like Will, to your point, is like there's this perception of, well, if the word freedom or free speech is used, and that's why I try to intentionally use that word a lot as someone from the left, because I'm like, no, fuck that. Like, we're not going to have a political party own. It's kind of like the rise of like the right owned like the American flag, flying it or whatever. I'm like, this is ridiculous. Like, no one group or identity should own freedom or freedom of speech. Like, those are like, in the US, those are very like American values. Around the world, people pride themselves on being able to like speak their mind and say what is good or what they think is bad, like freedom of speech. So it's this perception issue. The same thing with Bitcoin, and why, let's say, Democrats have such a tough time coming out in support or whatever, because there's like, okay, that's Trump's thing. We need to calculate how many hits are we going to take in this poll if we say we're pro Bitcoin versus we're pro this crypto or whatever the case may be. Same thing with like Nostr, and maybe they haven't said Nostr quite yet because it's still pretty small and niche comparatively, but the concept of free speech or a free speech platform or free speech communications, it's this kind of like risk adjustment of like how how worth it is that the perception level. And a lot of liberals and the left have chosen blue sky to say this is our option, and that has completely failed in my mind in terms of what it articulated to be. And I know Jack Dorsey and there's many others that have spoken out about that. I know Rabble still tries to do some good work there every now and again, but Nostr is the thing that is a clean slate for everyone in that regard. And I will say, I know a lot of the Bitcoiners specifically that I interact with on Nostr might disagree with me on certain points, but when I intentionally post things that could I don't do it to annoy people, but I'd be like, I'm making dinner, I'm a vegan, and I post like a vegan recipe on Nostr because I want to try to be intentional about like doing different things. And some people could be like, I don't want to follow vegan content. Great. I try to use the hashtag so people don't need to see it if they don't want to. But like people will actually interact with that on interesting ways. They'll be like, oh, cool. What do you think about this diet? Or, oh, I tried this for a little bit, but I felt better on this. I've actually had some like good back and forth with people on like that, or maybe some politics things in just a very intentional, like super early Facebook or Twitter type way. Whereas if I posted that on X, oh my God, like it would be hours of my day just ruined because I'm sitting here fighting with people, which is so annoying.
I've been on this network for about 2 years. I don't think I've ever had a situation where someone says it like, "Oh, you're an idiot. This is like stupid." That's like it's almost very like they're like they make the time to try to make their argument. I don't know why that is. Like it's just very strange. There's in some sense it's just a different network. Like why would it be any different? Why would the people be so different? But yeah, I've almost never had like a negative interaction, which is very strange.
Yeah, I think like to like our earlier discussion, the incentives kind of like, because like in Nostr, it's like a bunch of different people running relays, right? So the monetization model is actually like the quality of the network, if that makes sense, versus, X or other places. It's really the engagement. And that's just like, pairing ads with the engagement. So you got to get these things where it's like meant to like enrage you, keep you on the platform, and then keep you going, right? So Nostr can be like, I find I still maintain or have to maintain like a little bit of an X account, but I find that every time I spend on Nostr, it's just like significantly more pleasant. And then the other things like I refuse to pay for X Premium, so I can actually make like longer posts. But the other thing about the fact that like Nostr is very, I think to your earlier point, Trey, where you were like, well, it's hard to like pin down what this is. Don't forget they tried, or someone tried. Like Business Insider tried to dox like Fiat Chef.
Jesus Christ, that's right.
Yeah, and everything like that. But I think these
to my point of why I wrote an article last year being like, please, liberals, left, or whoever. And I say that because a lot of the mainstream media with authority kind of leans that way. This is kind of to a point that I talk with American Huddle about a lot offline and also on the podcast recently. It's like, it's not that like right and left, again, I'm trying to get out of this paradigm, but like the mainstream media or the left, like trying to demonize free speech as this, oh, well, Fiat Jeff is this right-wing supporter. Like this just nonsense that's like, I'm sorry, what does that have to do with the issue at hand here, right? That's just, it's criminal, it's insane, it's so frustrating. It's not a world I want to live in.
Yeah, but I don't think that the attack stuck because, well, I mean, Nostr is also like at its own stage of development. Obviously, there isn't like that many, like a crazy amount of like eyes on it in that sense, especially from the mainstream media. But I thought it was interesting because like, if you have a central figure, it's so easy to like lampoon the network and then also just like make it worse. But the other thing it does is because it's a person in a company, so first of all, like Elon, no matter what you think, and I happen to have like a pretty negative opinion of Elon for different reasons, but like it just shouldn't be him. It just like, it's not even like it could be like a saint whatever, right? It doesn't matter, like saint free speeches of like free speech land. It's the whole point is that there's a person. And if there's like a person, that person can be co-opted, even if they're the purest person ever or whatever, right? And people are going to start seeing that because like, for example, like the way countries regulate, it's the worst country. It's like the country that's going to go out and like arrest the founder of an app, or that will determine how the app is run. Like it's kind of crazy. Telegram is structured in such a way, I think they're still up, but apparently Durov, like he's responsible for the payments for all the infrastructure. Like, there's like a possibility of like, if you arrest him, that you could actually take down this whole company and therefore the platform. Right. So I just think that like this kind of approach just doesn't work for those reasons. And Nostr is appealing for that. But I also think in addition, I mean, there's also, you mentioned like Blue Sky and Mastodon that are kind of trying to do similar things, but Blue Sky still has like that board of governance or whatever. And they, they like look at your DMs, they have like reporting and like all this other stuff.
They still just have the one server too, right? Like, I don't think they've even kind of diversified that, what they said on the roadmap a couple of years ago.
I mean, Will, maybe you want to talk about why Nostr is like better than.
No, it's so funny because like I've designed Damus this way. If I was arrested and like or murdered or something, Damus would still work. Like it doesn't have any centralized dependencies. Yeah, there's the Damus relay, but you can get other relays, and so it's just not effective. Like I've always said that Nostr, people were saying, why aren't you supporting Elon in his fight against these tyrants? I'm like, I'm willing to support Elon if he wants to switch to a model. Like I want to disarm the tyrants. I don't want to try to fight them. Like just make their attacks ineffective. Because if there's no central point to attack, like imagine if like if some dictator wanted to shut down email, they can't. It's not like a single point you can go down to shut down email. Like that's what we're doing in Nostr. I don't know. People just forgot about we can actually design systems to be resistant against people. But so like yeah, centralization is the biggest issue here. And exactly what you're saying, Roger, is that Elon could get bored or he might have to focus more on SpaceX once he has his moon colonies and whatever. So he'll probably hand it off to someone else. And maybe they don't care as much about censorship resistance or free speech. So it's just going to go back to the same issues that it was before. So, let's just build it right. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think that gets to a good point too. It's not even about, because there could be some developers. I mean, this is the age-old thing in Bitcoin. It's like, for better, for worse, there's been developers that have been kind of like attacked like online based on their identity or their politics or whatever. And it's like building resilient systems. Like it shouldn't be around this kind of founder mentality or this engineer mentality. It's like, this is a good structure that we have been in the digital age now very comfortably for the past 24, 25 years, right? And kind of gotten to the point where all life, all business, most interactions happen in this digital world. So this is kind of just an update that we need. It's beyond just free speech or passionate Bitcoiners saying the world we want to see, all of these things. It's really like, why do we set it up? Like, and I think, again, Jack just talks about it really well. Like he wishes that he set up Twitter as a protocol and not a company, but it was just very early then. That concept wasn't around to run things in this way.
Well, people forget that like the internet was set up this way. Like, people didn't build centralized services. Email came from like the 90s and all the earliest internet protocols, like HTTP, like I think even TLS was like 1998 or something. I can't remember exactly, but and then I think there was just this huge propaganda campaign by big tech to like, it's like, no, those are not really usable. You should just use our centralized service. And they had a huge incentive to do that because they can collect, leverage massive network effects and collect advertising revenue and things like that. And people forgot about like the old ways that we used to build stuff. And now we're just simply returning to those old ways.
Yeah, that's fair.
Because people start to see the negative effects of these corporations and what they're doing.
Yeah. And I think more so the point is with social media, people have gotten so used to it. It has to be a company. It has to be this central server. It has to be for safety, right? There's that old political cartoon that I see so many times, like Bitcoiners share it a lot, but it's kind of like the government official and the corporation saying, how do you want to package this, as anti-terrorism or child safety? That is still, and that was, I forget when they said the cartoon, that was early 2000s. I think it was 2001, 2002. That's created a lot of the world we live in now. But yeah, that's so true. That's a nice way to put it, is returning to that. Or I mean, a lot of people on Nostr say it's returning to the spirit of the early internet and the way that it should be and going forward. And hopefully as we just kind of grow and as communities grow on Nostr, luckily it hasn't, at least in my opinion, I don't know, Will or Roger, if you have any thoughts. When I wrote that article, I think it was August 23 about Nostr and freedom of speech and why I think it's really important for anyone, especially if you're on the left and liberal or whatever. It hasn't gotten as much media of attention of like, look at this new right-wing platform, like a little bit. But I think I thought it would get a little bit more than that. So I'm glad. I hope that doesn't happen. And I hope that just as it organically grows with more communities, and by more communities, I mean the types of things that people are posting about, not just like demographics or race or gender, these things, kind of just more diverse content, which is slowly starting, that it'll just kind of seep out as these other structures fall to the wayside. That's my hope, at least. At least I think that it hasn't gotten too captured with that kind of language quite yet, but we'll see how that looks next year.
You're starting to see that they're trying, like, with that whole Fiat Jeff article, they associated with a fascism. But I think Nostr's too small, so the attacks aren't that effective. So I suspect the attacks will ramp up once Nostr starts getting more popular. And I noticed like a lot of a lot of like mainstream, they just try to avoid it, which is weird. Even though like the Jack Association, I find that super fascinating, right? Like this guy who built the biggest social media empire, and he's now focused on this thing. He believes this is the way, and almost like everyone's like, oh well, there's Blue Sky, there's Mastodon. It was like everyone's just ignoring, like, you know, he's going. I don't know. It seems strange to me that they're ignoring it. Even recently, I think MKBHD, he has one of the biggest tech review podcasts. He just did a whole episode on, you know, decentralized social media, and then they had everyone except any Nostr people. I was like, okay,
wow.
I don't know. So I guess we're still too small to mention by mainstream, and I'm kind of curious why, but I don't know.
It's kind of a sleeping giant.
That, actually, because I'm the token. Like everybody's always like, oh, like mainstream media's talking about Nostr, and then they don't realize it's just like me. I feel like that happens to me all the time.
I'm like, this is everyone always says it on Nostr. I'm like, this is Loki. Like this is this is this guy.
I'm like, people are
oh my
always
God,
like,
Forbes.
Oh,
it's like, oh, it's Roger.
Yeah. It's just Roger. But like, hey, how's it going? No, I mean, I do think, so I encountered this a lot because I've worn many hats in writing, and I wrote a lot about China issues for like all the major Canadian newspapers, like, but more what you would call like mainstream media. I have a lot of like friends who are kind of like in that circle, and they always ask me, like quite a few of them have like review copies of my book, and they're like curious about Bitcoin, but they can't actually like openly express it. And I think the same thing is happening to Nostr a little bit. Like I had an article I pitched to like a more mainstream outlet, and I really had to finesse to get Nostr in. Like it really was like, I had to like pitch it as like, oh, this is like this new decentralized, like people are a little bit, you know, I think it is a little bit of the function, the size of it. You know, I mean, obviously that's always going to be like, you know, part of it, like not only the size, but also I think in English, in other languages, this is less so the case, actually, I found. But in English, it's like sometimes the conversations can be very centered on like Bitcoin, and can be very centered on like certain people, I guess you could say. So there's a little bit more. It's getting better. I've noticed it myself, like on the experience, but there's definitely still that kind of like remnant. So not only is it like smaller, but also more like concentrated. So it's like really hard for like writers from outside to. Yeah, but my sense is that there's a skepticism about Bitcoin in mainstream media, and then that also like kind of legs down to Nostr. And when I've tried to pitch this to editors, I have to try really hard to separate the two. That's like the first thing.
I feel like that's kind of my fault, because I was like, I brought Zaps to Nostr because like Nostr has nothing to do with Bitcoin. There's happened to be like, you know, some Bitcoiners in the early days, but it's so weird that people think it is like it's a Bitcoin network, but in reality, it's so much bigger.
Well, it's not that people don't. It's not like people think, but like if they think it's a Bitcoin thing, then immediately the like editors are much more wary, right? So I tend to underemphasize the fact that, you know, there's like Bitcoin content, stuff like that, or like try to find a way to get around that.
And I try to do that in Damus too. Like I try not to mention Bitcoin. I just like, I always saw Bitcoin as one day in the future, it's just something that you don't have to think about. It just works. It's just ubiquitous. You know, yeah, because like Bitcoin has gotten such bad rap in the press, and people are just like, oh, it's that thing that like is causing global warming, or I don't know. And they just did, and that's enough. That's the end of it for most people. So I don't know. I think the more subtle approach is much better. And we don't need to blast it in people's face, right? It's like, we have a free speech network. There's a lot of things interesting going on. Yeah, there's a Zap thing, but it's just one tool in the toolbox, right?
Yeah. Maybe I'll go a little bit off on this because it's something I've been thinking about a lot, because a lot of with the book, you know, and everything else has been trying to get this into like, quote unquote, more mainstream outlets, right? Because, you know, you look at my writing and you're like, oh, like most of his bylines are Bitcoin Magazine and Forbes, and it's already like, whoa. But it's not actually that deliberate. I think there's a little bit of a like, you know, like, oh, there's like this dark conspiracy, and it's more benign than that, but also like the effects are malign, if that makes sense. It just happens to be the case that editors are like kind of the same crowd of people. Like they're the big city folks that kind of hang out with each other, and then they have to look good to their peers, and they have to look good to like their bosses, and they have to look good to their financiers, right? It's not necessarily even this like, I doubt there's like a worldwide directive to like not do Bitcoin content, or maybe I haven't gotten access to the tier of lizard people that are like really running our world that are saying that. But from what I've observed,
not yet, Roger. One day you'll get there.
Not yet. Yeah. Well,
you haven't been invited yet.
not yet. Not yet.
I'll get you in.
Not the lizard people.
I was like, Will probably has.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, no, Will. I mean, if you
No, they're chill. They're super chill. You
Yeah.
know, they just they're a little weird, but yeah.
Yeah. They just like kind of emerge. They're like a little cold blooded. That's all good. No, but like, I haven't seen it like that. But what I do see is like, there is like a tribe in media, and there's like people who are like outside of that, right? That kind of also hang out together. So like, you know, all of us people who write about Bitcoin in a positive light kind of hang out with each other. So I don't want to say it's like necessarily like a malign thing. You just kind of gravitate towards where your interests are. But yeah, there's definitely this thing where it's like editors. I noticed a lot in bookstores actually and libraries. I was going to comment on this because, you know, like now that I have the book and I'm trying to like promote this to like, so I've worked with like 2 bookstores really closely. I like buy tons of books from them. These are like China focused bookstores. They will not touch my book. There's like immigrant bookstores. They're like, no, like we're not, you know, that's what I'm saying. Like it's like, there's kind of like this like veil, and I think that's kind of what you're more dealing with. There's like this kind of like bookstore, library, editor. I don't want to make it seem like some dark network or something. It's just literally the effect of like, this is the world. If you go to the Vancouver Public Library, you're going to find the Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean. You're not going to find any other real Bitcoin books. And then you're going to find like 2 or 3 books from that guy, David Jarrell, like Attack of the 50,000 Foot Blockchain and all this other stuff. So I think like there is a little bit of like a bias in that, and it's not overwhelming. You can get Nostr and Bitcoin content in the right context, but it's definitely a lot more difficult. And you would think stuff like, oh, Jack is involved and stuff like that. But I also think Jack has been coded a little bit, like as a person. This is just kind of like my personal theory on this. Like now that he's spoken out at so many Bitcoin events and so many Nostr events, you know, it's like you kind of, I think the media is like very, I say this as someone who's written a lot. It's like very easy to portray people as characters. It's much easier to do that than anything else. Because at the end of the day, like your headline is like, sadly, 80% of like, you know, the thing. And the most accurate way to summarize things is like this person, that. And then everybody kind of has like an association with the person or with the concept. And so I do think Nostr and Bitcoin and Jack are kind of coded in this circle. And I do think, yeah, but that's Trey. I think like the work you're doing is so great because people who are more in that world are going to have access to this kind of content, and they're not going to like have their reflexive, some people, I'm not saying like all your listeners, but some people might be like team focused, you know, and this is true of the right wing as well. I'm not trying to say it's like a left wing specific.
Yeah.
They're like more team focused.
Well, this
like,
is yeah.
No,
this is why I love Rabble's team, because like he just inserted himself into a relatively like right-leaning Bitcoin network. I mean, and he is just trying to do something else. He's like much more left, much more, you know, methodical, talking to real, like kind of bring more people from the other side. And we need more people like Rabble, and the fact that he's sticking it out and saying, look, like this doesn't have to be a Bitcoin network. This doesn't have to be like a right network. This is just like he sees the potential in it. And this is why I have hope for Nostr, that it's not going to just become an insular community of just this people who think the same, you know, because people are starting to see that like this is a very important thing, and we need to make it diverse, and we need to make it, just instead of, we need to break the bubbles, right? And so Nostr's, I think we're heading toward that direction.
Yeah, shout out to Rabble. He's really rejected the Bitcoin narrative, and I don't mean that in a bad way, just in terms of how Nos is built, how Not Social, how just building up this team of this company, probably a lot from his own resources, like all of these things, and rejecting that. And I mean, Rabble's like, he looks like a leftist dude. He's like, it's just like in his DNA, like the things he likes to talk about, the things he likes to push forward. And that is the opportunity that Nostr has compared to Bitcoin. And even like it's really interesting too, and this is almost a whole nother episode and tangent, is Roger, what you're talking about. It's like journalism and media is still, it's very captured and pretends to not be from both sides, right? Whether it's like a right article or left, or like, this is why you should like really look into this or whatever. Whereas podcasting has gone the complete opposite way. Like over the years, that's why I enjoy podcasting so much. It's like podcasting is kind of found over the past decade. Obviously, Joe Rogan kind of created a lot of this and many others, but there's so many different types of people that come on, and people are really, you've seen the rise of podcasting. People are really itching and yearning for like off the cuff or different or truth seeking, even though it's just a lot of people's opinions. Whereas
nuance.
like media,
that's what I would say. Nuance.
Well, nuance. Well, and there's more time for nuance because you're talking like long form podcasting whatever people think of Lex Friedman and, whatever, just these long contents to really get into it rather than what's this 2-3 minute hit piece that I can read. So it's these two completely different worlds. And that's part of even my evolution on this show is like, started off the Progressive Bitcoiner, like inherited the title from my friend Mark Stefani, who will be recording an episode with soon. Really, really awesome guy. And I think in the life cycle of Bitcoin, it felt right because there was such like kind of right-only narratives about Bitcoin, this and that. I wanted to try to appeal and reach. And what I learned throughout this process, and it's kind of similar to Nostr, is that I want people to have content to seek out education when they're ready. You can't force Nostr on someone because it's so different in a lot of ways, like the way you approach it, even to access it. Sometimes there's a bit of a learning curve. It's getting easier, but for some people, if there's not a name and a password and a simple, the company reaches out and helps you reset your password, that's just too much for them. Similar to Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin's this different paradigm, this different operating approach to how you think about the world in a lot of ways. So for me, I'm kind of like just taking a step back and I'm like, listen, I'm not going to try to force feed liberals and the left anymore. Like I hope to be an example, being like, I was, and in some ways still that. This is what I learned about this. I'm going to talk with people I think are cool on this show and not try to make sure, is this checking off the box of the progressive mind? You know what I mean? Because then people will feel that it's inauthentic and all of this stuff. And that's why I love podcasting. And I think similarly, like what people can find on Nostr, and especially like I'd love to see, we're starting to see a little bit more, but like long form Nostr. And Lynn Alden has been such a good example of this. And I've talked to her about it. It's like, she's one thing on X kind of for her brand, for her website, for her, career and focus. And on Nostr, it's kind of like, all right, it's like you get home, you kick off your shoes and you're like, this is it. So it's not just like garbage, but it's kind of like, okay, these are my processes. It's more nuanced. It's kind of these creators and sometimes large people and followers. I think we could see this maybe of celebrities one day or huge journalists. They come on Nostr and they just kind of break down. They get out of the system or out of the echo chamber or whatever it is, and they break it down on Nostr. And then they come on a podcast on Fountain and they break it down more, which is now Nostr enabled. So I think Nostr and Bitcoin, but again, we'll focus on Nostr. Look at me, I'm doing it again. I'm comparing the two. I don't mean to, but just these different ways of doing things. Focusing on Nostr is bringing nuance back into our world, which is where people really live, and reminding them nuance and complexity and joy and hope and love exist outside of these algorithms and these companies that control everything.
I think it's interesting because I think podcasting isn't that much different from what we're trying to do on Nostr, because podcasting, especially podcasting 2.0 and all that stuff, it's a very decentralized thing. You can host your podcast on your server. And all of these things are freedom technology, and they're all really trying to do the same thing, which is, again, what you're saying, bring more nuance, and also just to break these caricatures of, and the algorithms really promote those as well, where it's like, let's try to promote this one very black or white, perspective so that we can attack it. So these like more bottom up approaches like podcasting, Nostr, we're taking a more nuanced approach. And I think it really, like, these freedom technologies are like healing kind of the brokenness that these centralized solutions are creating a lot of the problems, like the fiat system and all these things. So yeah, I think they're all part of the same web of solutions.
Yeah, no, and I definitely noticed, Trey, like, I mean, people who get on Nostr, it does feel like they're coming home a little bit, or some people, like Lynn is noticeably more cypherpunk, like on Nostr than she is on X, just like a tiny thing I noticed. I also, not to like call specific names out, but maybe slight shots fired, I like noticed the people who stay on X tend to like not have been, like, I'm always like, when I'm on X, I'm like the people with the worst cypherpunk takes, like,
have stayed in there. Oh yeah.
Like they're
dude, like Jeff Booth. Who was it recently? A few. I mean, Preston. There's so many others. Just from that classic like big X following groups have like either left X or like reduced it, and the people that are amplifying it have gotten even more. I mean, I hate this term, right? But like even more fiat, or even whatever we want to say. They've gotten even more just like like the things that we hopefully should want to reject has remained, and just. They're like, okay, I'm going to take this space. And it's like, okay, fine. We're going to be on Nostr chilling.
Yeah, no. And to be clear, it's like not all. And I've had a few conversations with people on that. Some people just like really love the user interface of X that like grew up with it or whatever. I don't really know. But like, yeah, there definitely are people, like the people I'm like, I go on X and I'm like, wait, this person said this? Like when they're like, the samurai arrest is like a really bad look for Bitcoin. I mean, that might have been a pretty specific shot fired. But like, then I look and I'm like, yeah, they're obviously not a Nostr. It's just like, what's the point of like this kind of content? So anyways, no, definitely see Nostr being I like what Will said. Like it's like a lifeboat and like kind of like a beacon.
Yeah, it's trying to fix brokenness. And, I think the last thing I wanted to touch on with you guys, we could chat for hours about this. There's so much, but the last thing I think I wanted to really touch on that I think people are interested in, and I'm interested in both of your takes, is just, where we're at, kind of back to the freedom angle, back to like the state of our world, for better, for worse, coming into a US election, post a US election, regardless of who wins. It just feels like governments around the world are heating up in terms of censorship, in terms of freedom. We kind of alluded to Telegram on here, which I think two things can be true at the same time. And Roger, you alluded to it. Like Telegram, the way it's set up is probably not great. The way it's set up in terms of how they actually run the app and the communications and all this, compared to other things. Like there's too many central points of failure and things the government can put on the founder saying you are responsible. Whereas many others, like, Will had said, with the structure of Nostr and a lot of how the clients are set up, and even Signal, that's a different conversation, but there are places that set things up so that where like I can't see, or I don't have control, or like, okay, you can arrest me, but I had no say over this. So with the state of things, they're going after founders, they're going after Telegram, they're going after free speech in any way that they can. Are you more hopeful about Nostr, like as a technology, like kind of this freedom tech aspect? Do you think that people will see that more and be supportive? Like it's good to see, right? Like places like the Human Rights Foundation, and I'm hoping others like that will see this is a net good for the world, kind of like how they did with Bitcoin, and having more. Like, how can you know? Like, oh, the Human Rights Foundation, they're the good guys, right? They're saying check on Nostr and Bitcoin, right? So are you feeling more hopeful right now? Are you feeling more worried that we're going to get into more of a state of like, as we say, like then they fight you and it's going to kind of be a little harder for a while before it gets better? How are you both thinking about, and Roger, just your study and analysis of China, what we're seeing in Brazil? I know I loaded a lot into that question, but how are we feeling right now with the concept of freedom tech and things like that going forward?
I think that you can tell the people running the ship, they no longer care about the ship they're running in some sense. Like they're basically just trying to use it for their advantage, use it for their friends, the Cantillon effect and all these things. So I think these defenses, these kind of weapons that we're building to defend ourselves from these people, are becoming increasingly important. Because I think it's going to get crazier. I think it's going to get. I think that there's going to be way more of this stuff. It's kind of even shocking to even say that, because sometimes we get the sense that we live in this free society and that things are getting better over time, and yet we keep seeing these like vagrant displays of just like not caring about the like First Amendment or free speech, and just like the arrogance of the people in charge and thinking they can control what people say or the types of interactions they can have between each other. I always like to say that we've always had decentralized speech. When you sit in a coffee, like in your living room with your friends, and you're just having a conversation that's private, this is like the original decentralized conversation. Mm-hmm. And all we're trying to do with Nostr is we're just trying to restore that in cyberspace. Like just being able to have a conversation where, a government or a corporation can't slam their foot down on the table and say, no, you're not allowed to say that, or you're not allowed to say that. It's like, no one has the right to do that. No one has the right to tell you what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say. So yeah, I think we're just trying to restore basic human interaction in some sense.
Yeah. And to the liberals listening, I say this all the time and I try to use it. I don't know if Trump needs to be president for them to see something. Let's say Trump sends DOJ after speech he doesn't like or something, whatever, insert whatever. If they can do it to one, and I use the Canadian trucker protest example a lot because a lot of liberals will be like, well, that was COVID and they shouldn't have been doing that and this and that. Well, it's like, well, insert Planned Parenthood into that and debanking. And okay, Planned Parenthood is banned from X and banned from all of this. I don't know. Use whatever example. I try to say this a lot to my liberal friends, but maybe just because it hasn't happened to them yet, that they don't see the urgency that I'm like, oh my gosh, the iceberg is right there. Like we can pivot. We can pivot now more comfortably. Let's do it. I agree. I do think it's going to get a little bad for a little while. And having these tools gives me hope. At least we have that. Without that, be looking pretty bleak. Roger, what about you?
Yeah, I think, we're early. Nostr, it's still early. I think we haven't seen anywhere near. China was close to being a country that like dedicated like some amount of resources. And that's why studying the Chinese example is pretty interesting, because I do think that will generalize a lot more in the coming years. And I'll explain that a little bit more. But I do think that Nostr right now what we've seen, and like, I just, throw it out there, like the people who are running the large relays, people like Will, and like what's going on with Damus, like please find ways to like support them. I think like that's going to be really important.
I'm proud of my Damus purple number 19. That's my badge of honor.
Wow,
right
you're
now.
19. That's amazing.
Number 19. That's like,
I think 19. I'd have to double check. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. Maybe we want to quickly talk about that. Like, I don't know that everyone knows about Damus purple, but yeah.
I was going to plug it at the end, but we can't. Or why don't you finish up your thought, and then because I want to do those plugs and stuff.
we can do all the plugs all at once, right? So it's like
and make Will super uncomfortable about how I think awesome Damus is.
So yeah, I mean, the way I think about it overall is like what you're seeing now, like what we just talked about, is that people don't necessarily see it unless it's like bluntly in front of their face, right? Like you have all these words, decentralization, relay, whatever. For like 95% or 99% of people, that's more like they encounter that not through like, long form content or anything. It's like literally like, I can no longer access this app, or I can no longer access this app in the way I want, right? So what we've seen is kind of more like what I would call like local state. And so this is kind of a technical philosophical term, but there's this thing of like states of exception. And the short of it is like, whenever there's like kind of quote unquote a crisis of any kind, right? The government steps in and then imposes like extraordinary powers. And so what you're seeing with the freedom of speech debate now is every country has its own state of exception, a local state of exception. And that's affecting the global web, because now they're demanding content be taken down, platform wide, or they're demanding that like a platform be taken down from their domestic app store, or they're demanding that like the platform is changed, or they're trying to arrest the founder and like implicitly maybe trying to shut down or co-opt the platform and the encryption keys and what have you, right? Which is kind of maybe the case with Telegram. So right now, that's Brazil, because they had after the election, they had like a similar event to January 6th. And so that's kind of like where the whole X thing came out of. And then in Telegram, actually not really too sure where this came from, but like the European Union has been trying to, and the EU is not as involved in this. It's really France's judicial authorities, really clear, because I've done some research on this, but, they're looking more and more, because they're sensitive to the war in Ukraine. And then there's this idea of like disinformation and misinformation, and states are trying to use the strongest argument possible to like enforce these policies through people, because people will be shocked and appalled. That's why when they went after Telegram, they really hit Telegram with like everything under the boat. But the things they wanted to stick were like, there's child pornography, there's like this or that, right? Like when the European Union is trying to deal with misinformation or disinformation, they like almost always refer to Russia, because like Russia's like so coded in the European dialogue now. It's like the enemy per se, right?
The US just did it again today, by the way. You'll have to look at it. I saw it just before jumping on here that the Biden and DOJ is like, Russia's up to it again. And it's like,
right.
Yeah, that's true. They always are. But again, the timing, September 4th, we're recording right now, the election in a couple of months, they're already getting it out there. This could influence the election. And I'm like, you're kidding me. This is 2016 again, which, but the timing of things, they're all, whether they're coordinating directly or not, they all are thinking from the same playbook. It's weird.
Yeah, no. But I actually think, so we're building the tools, and really will. I mean, I'm not really doing that much building here, but like people in the Nostr ecosystem are building. And I think that there's going to be some challenges ahead. I'm very optimistic about the state of the network now. I think it's a great place. Encourage everyone to join it, support the people within it. But I also think that, there's going to be a lot of challenges ahead. And part of one of the challenges is, this framework I'm saying, like, unfortunately, I'm a long-term optimist, but a little bit of a short to medium-term pessimist. I think whenever you've seen economic powers get as close as China and the US have, like the result is sometimes war, or most of the time war. And so if you think about like now we're talking about how like censorship resistance isn't really top of mind for most people, but that's because they haven't lived through it. I think that the world is going to create conditions more and more where it's like, war or different things. And then these topics, we saw it during the pandemic as well, right? To a certain degree, like because it was so polarized, and then the government really stepped in with all these powers, you might see more of those situations. So kind of like a reframe, like Will was making that point. It's like people seem to be giving up the boat. And I would just be really specific on that, which is that like the geopolitical situation to me, this is also my closest to the Chinese internet, where a lot of people are, for lack of a better word, very nationalistic. Not everyone, but quite a few. I do get the sense that like the world is bringing more towards a conflict state than we've ever seen, right?
Mhm.
In a world where there's like a lot more debt and everything related to that, and in a world where there's all these, you can say like different issues that are happening. And so I just see the power, because remember, like the American government only seized gold during, World War II. There were like rations and things like that. Obviously, there was the whole history of that. But when you get into these states of exception and it becomes more global, that's where I think people are going to really realize, I mean, for money, because banks and how you spend your money will be restricted, but also really for speech, like how you talk. And that's one thing that I think most people realize in the Chinese case, like it's not that often that it's actually direct censorship, in the sense of like, hey, like, you can't say this or that thing. Actually, what's happening in the Chinese internet now is that like, if you say certain things, you're going to be so unpopular on the network. Some of that's because of censorship, that there's also the like social shaming element, right? Like almost if you went on X right now and I'm going to just say this, like if you post an anti-Bitcoin take, like everyone in Bitcoin Twitter is going to like get on you, right?
Mhm.
That's kind of more how people start getting more and more quiet in these conversations.
Yeah.
And then your overall dialogue is kind of, so I think like both the conversation is going to get more rage conversation, because there's going to be a lot, not going to say a lot, but there's going to be some things that people are going to really rage about, right? Like you're talking about war, you're talking about potentially people really like, China hasn't fought a war since 1979. If they do that, I think it's going to be like such a shocker, just like in Russia, and now like the conversation around it, and rightfully or wrongly, I definitely, think what's happening there is terrible. But it's amplified the stakes for speech and for money. And I think that's just going to continue. And so Nostr is building for a future where we can be resilient to that. I don't think it's like quite ready to be like production ready to be resilient against all of that. But I think the way the network is developing and the way the different applications are coming together is helping towards that direction.
I think Nostr is a huge threat to the existing power structures and the status quos. Like, big tech and big government, they're not going to just like roll over and like give up their silos, their cash cows, their huge advantage over like being able to control speech. And I think I saw a glimpse of that. Like this is when I got banned in China from the App Store. Also, when Apple threatened to remove my app because I had zaps in it. The zaps were a threat to kind of like their central monopoly over the money at the payment system, and then the free speech aspect was a threat against censorship and things like that. So I think they're going to put up a fight. And this is why recently I've been thinking about, I gotta diversify my client. I can't just be on the Apple App Store. The minute things get heated, the minute they're like, they can just take me out in an instant. So I've been working on a new multi-platform client that works on Android, all platforms, because I'm just getting ready for this fight, because I feel like the fight is coming and it's going to get ugly, and it's going to be, it's going to be because of fiat effect. It's going to be because of these, because they're not going to want to give up their power, and I think it's going to be pretty scary ahead. But I think I'm confident that there's enough cypherpunks who believe in a future where citizens take back control of their speech and their freedom and their free will from these corporations who don't care about them. So I'm still very excited, but I don't think it's going to be an easy fight, but it's going to be worth the fight.
Yeah, and to Roger's point too, I think what I've seen too, and obviously I saw it on X here and there, is you'll also have quite a bit of, and I don't know if you've seen this or even heard this directly, Will, there's been more Bitcoiners. When there was the Brazil stuff and, Telegram or whatever, there were more people that were coming in Nostr, or more people, I think Callie was posting everyone's like InPub on X, and Bitcoiners were, also what happens on X is everyone feels like, okay, well, let me give an opinion. I have 25,000 followers. I need to get my opinion out there on this exact moment, having no knowledge of anything. And I saw a lot of people fudding Nostr, saying, well, it can still be banned. They wanted to, the whataboutism is so prevalent. And it's the point is, yes, there still need to be more relays. Yes, like you're saying, Will, you need more time and devs and funding to build out more clients beyond just the App Store and do these things and progressive web apps and all, just to mitigate every risk possible. And the reality is, technology, we can, and I think Nostr will build every technology that's needed to have it function in the most hostile environments, but there's still politics. There's still governments that can still kick in your door and arrest you if they caught word, or they think, or maybe they don't think. They're just like, we're just going to do this, and maybe you did, maybe you're not, and we're going to arrest you. That can still happen. There are governments that will still murder their citizens if they assume this. Like, technology will not prevent that, right? And I hope, and I'm not advocating for any revolution or any violence. Like, everything's very, very peaceful that I'd like to see, especially with technology. So, but to see Bitcoiners fudding it in that way, rather than being like, help, fund. Some of them are wealthy individuals saying this. They're like, it's kind of like, well, what'd you expect? And it's like, would you say the same thing about Bitcoin? No, you don't, because your financial future is wrapped up in Bitcoin. But you're saying about Nostr because you benefit from a X algorithm or whatever, until you don't. So that's been disheartening for me to see. So if you're a Bitcoiner fudding Nostr, like, there are, like, I think a lot of people in Nostr, myself included, have like posed questions, said certain critiques. I felt even before this was a while ago, maybe 6 months ago or so, being like, I don't know what's going to be of Nostr. I don't know. Is it growing? Is it not? I think there's so many fair critiques, and devs need to hear input, I think, in respectful ways to know, to get different, obviously anything you're building, if there's an echo chamber of that, or if you're only building on it by yourself, you're not going to see certain angles that other people might. So that stuff's important. People being like, well, Nostr won't work because they can still ban the relay. So, and just, that's the last word. I'm like, you guys are fudding this one. This is really important. Like, I think this is a net benefit for the world, and it's really important. And so I'd like to see Bitcoiners stop fudding Nostr in that way. It's super disrespectful to the work.
And the way that they're fudding it, it's like, it's not even hard to solve those problems. It's like, it's kind of like saying, oh, they're just going to ban all the web servers on the internet, and then then we won't have internet, or we don't have the web. It's like, well, if we build it in the right way, everyone can have their own relays. We can build clients way more decentralized. It's partially my fault, because I created the client in a very like non-decentralized way. You really only configure like 5 to 6 relays, which is censorship resistant among those relays, but it doesn't access a wider web of Nostr. But we're starting to see in Nostr, we're starting to build clients that are much more like the web, where it actually reaches out to many different relays automatically, and it's much more decentralized. So I say, like, to those Bitcoiners who are judging it based off the early versions of it, like, we're making it way more decentralized. We're making it way more better in that sense. So give it another shot and give it another look.
Sweet. Well, guys, this was a great conversation. I think to be continued. I've had so many episodes recently where I'm like, gosh, we got to do like 5 parts on this. But thank you both for coming on. I super appreciate it. Go ahead and get Roger's book if you haven't already. It's super interesting. I think there's a lot of Bitcoin books in the space that's great. But what I liked, Roger, still about your book is I learned a lot of new stuff. And when someone like, I'm looking for interesting stuff to learn more, being in Bitcoin for only 3 years now, but you kind of hear the same stuff over. This is interesting. This is learning about China. This is learning about freedom tech in China and Nostr. So super cool. Please support Will and Damus. Damus is my daily client. I'll just say that. There's so many other clients as well that are getting better and better. Damus is still my daily driver. I'm like an iPhone guy. And Will, to your point about the way you built it, I think one of the benefits too, just to give a shout out, is that it made it easier for someone like me to get in. Like, for whatever reason, my onboarding to Nostr was Christmas Eve 2022. I don't know. I must have had a moment where I was like, oh, okay, I'll try this. And it was Damus, because at the time it was like, oh, this feels the most like Twitter. And I really clung to that. I really clung to like, I need it to be Twitter. And I'm getting more on board with this is the everything app that's being built in. So check out Damus, check out other clients. If you haven't already, you can follow any of us. I'll make sure our pubs are in the show notes. But anything else you guys want to give shouts to? I know, Will, you kind of already mentioned you're working on some new stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to support us, we have a Damus Purple subscription. So that gives you a cool little star. It gives you a unique number. As you said, you got number 19, which is crazy. But you also get automatic translation. So it's really great if you want to communicate with everyone else around the world. And it automatically translates as you scroll, which is pretty cool. So that's a really good way to support us if you're on iOS. And if you're not on iOS, you can check out damus.io/notedeck, NOTEDECK. And that's our multi-platform client that we're going to be releasing before the end of this year. And then next year, we're going to have an Android client, which is based off the same technology. So you can join the waitlist on our website. And so check it out and get involved.
Roger, what about you? I know you're having articles that keep coming out and any other stuff to let people know about.
Yeah, I mean, the book Mao Hold Bitcoin still doing the tour, so hopefully coming to a city near you. If any of you want to follow me on Nostr or X, but preferably Nostr, given the conversation, and just everything overall about that. I'm gonna be trying to be better at like posting where I'm at, like physically. So I'll be at Bitcoin Amsterdam, like a couple of other events.
Nice. I'll be there too.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so I'll see you. Awesome. And maybe you'll give me my invite to the Lizard People Forum, like in person.
Well, let's go to the banter room and we'll chat.
The banter room and chat. We'll do that. Can't believe it made public record. I love it. Yeah. And I guess like the last thing I would say is just like, yeah, people are tentative about like Nostr or anything, or just any of the clients. I think Damus is like such a great experience. For example, like I would just highly encourage people to like dip their toes in and try. And I have a guide somewhere on my Forbes profile, but there's also other guys out there, and basically like setting up your first zapping wallet, like maybe setting up like your NIP05, which is kind of a way to make it more easy for people to like copy and paste your key. My NIP05 is Loki at Nostr-verified, as some people have noticed. And I put that on my Forbes profile, which people have also commented on. So it's kind of like a cool way to like spread that out. So yeah, I mean, just like get involved, come on in, the water's warm. And hopefully people who are listening to the show, like, either they're on Nostr already or they're thinking about joining, and this takes them to the final step, because that would be a really great thing.
Cool. And Daniel, who does art for us and works at PubKey, he would kill me if I didn't mention this. You, at the time of this recording, I've already said September 4th, but you were going to be at PubKey in New York City next Thursday. Is that right?
Yeah. I'll be, so HRF, props to them. They're putting up a series. I think they do like the monthly. And so September 12th, I'm going to be in New York City at PubKey. And I'll be bringing like the book. We'll be talking about the book. It's with Alicia, who's their head of communications. And I think you're going to, like hopefully people come. I think it's going to be a great conversation, obviously very focused on Bitcoin and China, but hopefully I'll be able to also spread my wings on other topics and learn more about lizard people in between.
Cool. Yeah. So if you're in New York City or in that area, head down to PubKey for the 12th. I'll put that in the show notes too. I think there's a way to register through Meetup or their different.
And there's like a meetup. Like
Yeah.
Like a few people are, I think like 60 people or something registered for it.
Cool. Thank you so much, guys. Appreciate it. I'll see you both on Nostr. Keep up the good work, and we'll do this again.
Thanks a lot.
All right, see you guys.